So, you started a Space Marine army. Somehow, after starting 7 armies, I haven't started a Space Marine one yet. So to kick off the channel, I think it's finally time I get started with that. I'm Plaid Hobbies, welcome to the show, and without further ado, let's get hobbying. I've been building model kits for about 10 years now, and Warhammer for just over 2, so I'm not really a stranger to Space Marines. Though out of the 7 armies I currently have, just regular Space Marines are shockingly not one of the ones that I've started. I have some special homebrewing in mind for this army, so what better way to start than a fresh, plain old box of Intercessors. As much of a chaos guy as I am, tipping my toes into the grim darkness of the Imperium sounds like a nice hobby change of pace from the usual demons and armor trim I'm used to. Cracked open the box and got hit of that nice new plastic smell. I grabbed my usual tools and started snipping. After cutting out the parts I needed, I grabbed some single-bladed sprue cutters. These are great for cutting nice clean cuts into plastic. Rather than 2 blades pinching the sides of the plastic like normal cutters do, these have a single blade on one edge and a flat edge on the other, letting the blade slice through the plastic like butter. I started fully cleaning any leftover nubs with a hobby blade, trimming off any excess plastic and sanding it flat and smooth with a medium grit sanding stick. And with that, we got enough legs and torsos to start assembly. I started working on the Sergeant first. I figured since he has the most detail and customization getting put into him, I can kind of use him as a basis to figure out what I want the rest of my Marines to look like later. Once I stuck the torsos together, I started clipping out the arms, the bolters, and the backpacks. I did the same style of nub removal as I did on the rest of the parts to get the backpacks nice and crispy. I took a look at the instructions to pick out what weapon options I wanted, but I'm personally more of a fan of Rule of Cool over WYSIWYG, so I just clipped out whatever was cool for the Sergeant, cleaned him up, and attached them. Another quick fix you can do to your models is drilling out the gun barrels. I grabbed my sharpest PCB drill bits and looked for one that had the perfect size. I poked a guiding hole at the center of the barrel with my hobby blade. This should help guide the drill bit. Once that was all done, I started gluing the arms to the torso. It's much easier to drill the gun barrels before the arms are attached. Once I got my Sergeant good and ready to go, it really sunk in what was in store for the rest of this army. So, I grabbed my tactical hot chocolate and locked in. After all that building, I took the agonizing 5 feet journey to the other side of the room to grab my bit spin. This is the real fun of kit bashing. I always keep any extra bits of spare sprues I have left over from other builds. One day this landfill will be used for something, and that day is today. The bin I have is a mix of extra bits from kits that I've built in the past, bits bags, and any other 3D printed pieces that I've made over the years. One day I'd like to organize this a little better. Started looking for any cool looking pieces that I could find. Even if you don't think you'll use it for anything specifically, it's always good to just find anything that catches your eye, because it might give you some inspiration later on down the line, and who knows, you might end up still using it. Once I picked out all the loose bits, I grabbed some spare sprue and started cutting out any parts that I saw in there as well. Once I found all the bits that I thought looked pretty interesting, I grabbed all of them together and started dry fitting them to the models. The most important thing with kit bashing is to make sure you dry fit everything first, or at least hold it in place with some blue tack. I'm usually a cut first, never measure kind of person with projects, but in this case I'd prefer not to ruin these expensive little plastic fellas by gluing something I don't end up liking. After looking at my Sergeant a little bit more, I decided to give him a little more flair to make him stand out more. I grabbed this halberd from the GreyTideStudios box and started hacking off the handle that was already part of the handle. I separated the blades and the pole and sandwiched the Marine's fist between the 2 parts. Then I grabbed this lantern piece that I 3D printed from GreyTideStudios and attached it to the other arm with some super glue. I definitely recommend pinning these as well, but I got a little lazy, so do as I say, not as I do. And once he was well armed, I started picking out the perfect dome for him. I'm going for a more royal look with my Marine chapter, so these Dark Angel styled helmets will be perfect. Another thing I decided on while I was making them was to give them a blank chest. The Imperialis definitely fits the royal vibe that I'm going for, but I kind of want to leave room for myself to do some freehanding or any other detail work later on down the line, and I think having a blank chest will definitely help me with that. I didn't end up giving these guys any chest details in the end, but I think I'm going to save that detail specifically for characters and elite units. I started grabbing all the weapon options for the rest of the fellas and started dry fitting some of the custom parts, also from GreyTideStudios. If you're trying to get some good poses on your plastic miniatures, hobby cement's the best way to do it. It doesn't dry as quickly as some other glues do, so you have a lot more time to move around the arms to get the pose that you really want. After that, I removed any mold lines from the helmets and the backpacks. Next up, the main motif I wanted for my custom chapter, candles. I'm gonna need a lot of candles for this army, so mass printing these from GreyTideStudios was the way to go. I'm from Canada, so I can't exactly use my resin 3D printer this time of year because outside is so I printed as many as I could before it got too cold. I attached all the candles in a random order with some super glue. I didn't bother keeping it clean since the messiness will kind of only help the look. Plus the super glue will mostly be covered in the next step anyways. While I had the super glue out, I started attaching any other 3D printed bits that I had, like these loincloths or armpit shields. These are also from GreyTideStudios. After fussing with the super glue, I moved on to gluing any other plastic bits onto my Marines with some hobby cement. This meant pouches, purity seals, holsters, the works. I didn't really have a plan when gluing these down, I kinda just found cool spots that I think that these would look good on. I purposely left the shoulders, helmets, and backpacks attached with some blue tack. This will make them a lot easier to paint later since I can remove them. Another motif I wanted to try out for this army, at least for the Primaris helmets, was to remove the mouth grill. I grabbed some Tamiya spot putty. This stuff's great for filling in any sort of gaps in a plastic miniature. I squeezed some out into a toothpick and slightly put it over the holes in the helmet. I tried to smooth it as best I can before it dried, but the real cleaning comes later with sanding. While that dried, I broke out the milliput to sculpt some wax dripping down from the canals on the backpack. This will also cover up any gaps from the 3D printed parts on the miniature. I mixed up equal parts together and started adding little balls of it into the gaps, squishing them down with a ball-tip sculpting tool. After that, I sanded down all the Tamiya putty on the helmets to get a nice flat look. These guys were looking a bit too factory fresh, so the next thing I wanted to do was add some physical battle damage to their armor. First thing I did was figure out where I wanted the bullet holes. I poked those spots with a hobby blade, and then once I got my little guide points in, I grabbed my pin vise and started drilling holes through the armor. Once the bullet holes were drilled, I grabbed some hobby cement and used that to clean up the area where I made the cuts. It's a small detail, but it does really help sell that battle damaged look. Chains are also a great detail to add to your Warhammer army, so I wanted to have a few here. I cut them out slightly longer than I needed with some cheap hobby cutters. I used some super glue to glue on the chain, and after fussing with it again, I think we can call the kitbashing done. Personally, my favorite part of the hobby is basing. There's just so much you can do with basing your armies to make them stand out, as well as telling a little bit of a story for each miniature. I've done my fair share of Gunpla outside of Warhammer, which means I've done my fair share of dioramas as well. They take a while to build, so using Warhammer as an excuse to build essentially hundreds of little palm-sized dioramas really quickly is always something I'm going to be excited about. I grabbed some of the essential basing materials, cork from the dollar store, and bark chips. I'm going to go for a more wintry, sort of rocky basing scheme for these guys, so these materials will do perfectly. I started breaking off random chunks of cork and roughly shaping them with my hands to roughly fit the base sizes. I grabbed some hot glue and started attaching the chunks. I tend to do slightly taller and extravagant bases for the characters and squad leaders. This helps them stand out a little bit more. I ripped up some cork and started gluing them down to the rest of the bases. After that, I grabbed more milliput, mixing up 2 parts again equally, and started squishing these bits into the cracks of the cork to fill them. I started stamping some extra cork into the milliput to help give it that texture and blend it into the rest of the bases. While those were drying, it's time to add a bit more texture to these bases. I then grabbed all the essentials. Various sizes of rocks, pebbles, and sand, some AK Interactive texture paste, and some wood glue to hold it all down. Texture paste I just smeared on with an old brush. After that, I filled in the larger gaps with some wood glue and sprinkled in some rocks and sand. Sharper details like this will help contrast with some of the more softer details of the cork. Storytelling is one of the coolest things you can do with bases, even subtle things like blood or skulls. Just help paint a bit of context for what's going on with your army. For example, I found these 2 old failed Necron 3D prints that I had lying around, so maybe some dead Necrons on one of the bases could be a bit of storytelling. I also play Necrons as one of my armies, so adding one with my army's color scheme on the base would be a little fun Easter egg as well. I grabbed the ever so famous Citadel Skulls box and started snipping out some Xenos skulls to lay them on my bases. I have some friends in my Warhammer group that also play Orcs and Tau, so you know I have to add some of those skulls onto my bases. And with that, the bases are done, the models are done, which means the most boring step is next. Priming. Priming might be my least favorite part of the hobby. It's the boring step that comes right after all the fun stuff like kit bashing and basing, but it's also the roadblock right before you get to do the other fun part, which is painting. I usually try to batch prime as much as I can, that way I always kind of have something to pick up and paint whenever I feel the urge to. Juiced up my airbrush with some of my favorite primer, Vallejo Mecha Primer, and got started. Once the primer was good to go, I attached all my bases and Space Marines onto some double stick tape onto a paint stirring stick. Once they were all lined up together, it made it a lot easier to prime them all at once. While the primer dried, I grabbed this old 9th edition Space Marine model. This guy's usually my test dummy for figuring out certain colors I want to use. So for the undercoat for that, I used a dark red. Not only will this make the top coat a lot warmer, but it'll also add a nice warm shadow from the underside of the model. After that, I tried to figure out my base color. I grabbed these 2 Tamiya paints and sprayed both over top the test model to see which one I liked better. In the end, the winner was Desert Yellow. Once I got all the colors good to go, I did the same dark red undercoat on the 10 Marines. Once that was good, I grabbed my Tamiya paint and then sprayed it just from above, almost like a heavy zenithal. This will still let the red base coat show a little bit underneath as a shadow. Airbrushing colors is always a fun step. Not only is it a really fast way to apply colors to your models, but seeing the models come to life so quickly is always such a satisfying step that fills you with like so much encouragement. And now, on to doing things the old-fashioned way. Now that all the base coats have been applied, I tried finding a good highlight color. I wanted to keep a rich, vibrant color for the highlights to contrast the more cold, dull base coat. After testing a few, I settled on Citadel's Zemesi Desert. Personally, I'm not a fan of edge highlighting every part of my miniatures, so dry brushing is usually my go-to for general highlights. I tend to save brush highlights for only certain parts of the miniatures that I want to really make pop. Once my dry brushing was done, I grabbed some Corvus Black and began picking out all the armor trim and any parts of the model that I wanted to keep black. I really like Corvus Black because it has a lighter tone to it rather than it just being a pure dark black. I try to avoid pure white and pure black where I can. Listen, I gotta use my art certificate for something, so let me tell you a couple of 3 things. One of the main things I remember from color theory was to avoid using pure white and pure black wherever you can, even for lightening and darkening colors. It's not a be-all end-all rule, of course, but mixing colors into colors to darken and lighten them is kind of a better way to do it because you can keep different vibrancies. Black and white also tend to kind of desaturate colors when you mix them into it. Pure white and black tend to just be a bit jarring and unnatural looking on their own, unless you're doing something more graphical, of course. Look, I'll save color theory for a whole other video, it's kind of its own big rabbit hole, but that's just my 2 cents for now. Before I continue with any of the small details, I wanted to do some paint chips on the armor. I used a dark brown rust paint and dipped a sponge into it, removing any excess paint on a paper towel, then lightly dabbing the sponge onto the model. There's tons of ways you can do paint chipping for armor, but I find sponge chipping is the easiest and quickest way to do it. Next up, I grabbed a light gray paint and picked out any of the areas I painted with Corvus Black. I started dry brushing, making sure I was a bit heavy-handed, that way I kind of created a bit of a weathering effect on some of the large, flat surfaces. Next thing I wanted to tackle were the shoulders. I picked those out with the absolute goat of white paints, Pro Acryl Titanium White. Now, I know I just said to avoid pure white and pure black where you can, but I'm just using this white as a base for the next paint, because now what I'm going to do is tint it with an off-white color. I grabbed some Skeleton Horde contrast paint and began applying it all over the white parts I just painted. This will transform it from a white to a sort of off-white bone color. Then I dipped my brush in some water to remove a bit of the contrast paint from the highest points of the shoulder pads. This should give the illusion of a highlight. I pulled out the helmets and did the exact same thing on those as well. After that, I took some more of the white and lightly dry brushed it over. I went back to the backpacks and highlighted those as well with the same gray I did earlier. Next up was the candles. For the wax, I essentially did the same thing as the shoulders. White undercoat, light coat of Skeleton Horde over top, and then white dry brushing above that. Next up was to pick out their bolters. First thing I did was hit them with contrast paint and rattling grime. I wasn't too happy with the results. I find for the most part, contrast paints tend to work better if you have like a white undercoat. It kind of makes the pigment stand out a little bit more. So very roughly, I repainted them with some titanium white and then recoated it again with rattling grime, and this looked much better.
Mother doing a lot worse.
Once the contrast paint dried, I hit it with a dry brushing of silver. This really makes it stand out as like a cold hunk of metal. There's a few other parts that I wanted to match the head and shoulders, so I started to pick those out as well with the same steps as earlier. I went back to the helmets and added a few very rough highlights to the areas that would catch the most light. After that, I feathered them out with some water to make a smooth transition. I continue to pick out all of the small details on the armor. I tend to not put as much effort into these parts as I do into the other parts of the model, since these tend to not be the focal points, so these usually just get a quick base coat and a very, very quick highlight. I did the same thing highlighting all the smaller details I just picked out, either with a controlled brush or a dry brush. I thought the red on the bolters was looking a bit dull, so I went back in with contrast ball red, which made it pop a lot more. A coat of Agrax Earth Shade went all over the parchment and the fabric pieces. While it was wet, I took a paper towel and dabbed away a lot of it. The texture of the paper towel really made it stand out and look a lot more like parchment and fabric. All of the metallic bits got a quick coat with some gold paint. The chains and other silver parts got the exact same treatment that the bolt guns did. The candles got a quick treatment of some Skeleton Horde, and then I grabbed the paper towel and dabbed away the excess. This will also give the wax a bit of texture. Now that all the brush painting is done, I can finally glue the backpacks and shoulders together. I used hobby cement for the plastic backpacks and super glue for the resin ones. After that, I broke out some decals. Not quite sure what decals I wanted to use for the rest of the army, since I was still kind of figuring things out, so I was kind of just testing the waters with these guys. Putting some decal setter on the shoulder will really help the decals adhere to the model. Once I poked all the decals into a place I liked, I used some Mr. Mark softener to soften the decal a bit. This should help the decal conform to the surface that it's on a bit better. Now to finish the heads. I painted their eyes black as well as some red war paint over the eyes. My Space Marine chapter ritualistically blinds themselves as a rite of passage, so marking their helmets with this as well as the black eye lenses can kind of help show that off at a quick glance. Once that was done, I grabbed some more paint and started picking out any of the details in the helmet that I wanted to be a different color. I wanted to try freehanding some checker patterns on the heavy bolt guns, and this was kind of my first attempt at freehanding and it went rough. I do a lot of drawing in my free time, but digital drawing has definitely humbled me compared to painting with like a regular real brush. Nevertheless, this is an attempt I probably won't fix. It's my first time and it's kind of a good thing to look back at these on the future as reference and how you can improve. Now that we're getting close to the end of the hand painting process, I picked out any of the bits on the models that I had previously missed. This meant giving a wash to the metallic parts, picking out any other parts of the helmet that I wanted some color on, and then adding highlights of those colors as well. I went back to the shoulders as well and added a bit of paint chipping over the decals. And now, for the really fun part, enamels. Enamel paints are a great tool to have in your painting arsenal. There's a ton of things you can do with them, but weathering is usually my go-to. They're also great for making your models appear very grimdark and grimy. Now watch in horror as I dunk all 10 of these miniatures into a nice batch of enamel paint. I've done enamel washes before on my miniatures. This Seraphon Carnosaur is a great example of how I want the end result to look. I plopped some into a very cheap airbrush and began coating the entirety of each model. I didn't go too heavy-handed with the enamel paints, I kind of just wanted to tint the model a bit. I find dunking them fully in enamel paint with a brush isn't really necessary, and it also wastes a lot of paint. Now that they're all coated and dried, I grabbed some white spirits and some Q-tips. I dipped the Q-tips lightly in some white spirits and started dabbing it on the model. This will pick out all the enamel paints from the raised areas and leave a lot of them in the recess. Not only will this shade the model for us, but it'll also tint the armor to make it look a lot grimier and dirtier. Now that a good chunk of it has been removed from the higher areas, you can really see the effect we're going for here. Once the enamels were all cured, I took a dry brush and started highlighting some of the higher points of the model again. This will help bring back a lot of the shine that a lot of the metallic parts had before giving it the enamel wash. I gave all the candles a quick dry brush with some white only at the very tops to help prep for the next step. This will give the inks a nice bright base coat to go over top of. And now, I began prepping for what is the scariest part for me. Object source lighting. This was the part I was looking forward to the most, mainly because it was kind of the main motif of the army. Blue magical aura coming from the candles and the inside of the armor, illuminating the underside of the helmets. I got a bit heavy-handed with the airbrush and ended up doing the effect a bit overboard. I sort of accidentally masked a lot of the process that I had already made. Honestly, I was pretty disappointed, so I kind of put this project away for a few weeks, feeling like I'd completely ruined the models. But you know what? It is what it is. It's all part of the process. Every time I see these models in the future, I can look back on them and improve on what I felt I could do better at the time. And honestly, sometimes all you need is to take a step back from a project, revisit it, and sometimes you realize it's not as bad as you originally thought. And that's exactly what happened here. After a few weeks, I came back to this, determined to salvage what I could and keep going. And you know what? I still wasn't totally happy, but it wasn't nearly as bad as I remembered. This is the kind of stuff I want to make sure you guys see in these videos. It's never going to be a simple process, and I never want to paint it as that way. Something will always go wrong, and that's totally okay. Art and mistakes go hand in hand. You gotta screw up to get better. Honestly, looking at them, I think the underglow from underneath the helmet is okay. The main issue I have is really with the candles. They don't really look like they have a source light. They kind of just ended up all blue. So I went back in, applied some very watery white ink to them, leaving some of the blue visible from underneath. The second half of this fix is coming later on in the project. So I was debating for a while on how to paint these bases, until something kind of caught my eye. This Space Marine model is one that I painted over 4 years ago, way before I even started playing the game. Something about this model always stood out to me despite the paint job not being very good. But I think it's the base. I've always kind of liked how it looked. I don't know if it's the color or the composition, but something about it always stood out to me. So in honor of one of the first Warhammer miniatures I've ever painted, this entire Space Marine army will share this same basing scheme. First thing I had to do was replicate the colors I did all those years ago, because I sure as hell don't remember what they were. Closest one I could find for the base coat was this Tamiya light gray. And honestly, after spraying it, there's a good chance this is probably what I used. I mainly only had Tamiya paints at the time since Gunpla was mainly what I painted, so there's a good chance this is probably what I used. For the highlights, I tried using AK Interactive Neutral Gray. It didn't really stand out all that much, so I also tried looking for what paint I possibly used back in the day. And from the looks of it, this Tamiya paint seems pretty close. I tried dry brushing it and I was pretty happy with the result. Committed to that paint, I dry brushed the rest of the bases with it. And at the end, I did a final white dry brush on the very highest points of the bases. After all that, I finally got to glue on my Marines. In hindsight, I should have glued them on after painting the skulls and the bases, but honestly they didn't get in the way too much, so I think it's fine. Before painting the skulls, I painted this Necron head on this base to match my Necron army's color scheme. Once that was done, I base coated all the skulls with a chocolate brown and then worked my way up highlighting to a light beige. After that, I gave them a cover of Skeleton Horde to shade them and add a bit of a brown tint. Once those were painted, I slapped on the snow effects. I know for sure that this is the same snow paste I used all those years ago. So I got these bases as close as possible to the original. I grabbed the exact same grass tufts that I used on the original model. I started plopping them here and there on the base, fitting them wherever I could. I didn't bother gluing these down. I find the adhesive actually sticks pretty well enough on its own. The last main thing I had to do was go back to those damn candles and fix them once and for all. With some blue paint, this time I dry brushed only from the tops of the candles. Still not perfect, but it definitely gives it more of a glowy effect than last time. After giving the candles that blue dry brush, I grabbed some white paint and painted just the tips of the flames with it. Once that was done, the helmets could finally be glued down in place. And after weeks of progress and procrastinating, I can finally paint the rims of the bases. And with that, my first unit of Space Marines and the first video on this channel can finally be called done. So I think we've earned some money shots. Well, that was certainly a time. Honestly, finally taking a crack at Space Marines has been so much fun. Something I feel like every wargamer should at least try doing, even if you don't play it as an army. Space Marines are such a nice blank slate for homebrewing and customizing. And as you saw at the start, I had quite a few other things in my backlog ready for this army, so I do plan on using some of those for some videos as well. You know what, despite some of the setbacks I had with this, I still had a lot of fun, and I'm really looking forward to fixing some of the mistakes that I made with these guys on any future models. This video was essentially a 4-month process of researching YouTube, editing softwares, cameras, deciding the vibe and aesthetic of this channel, and even getting this hobby room set up after 6 weeks of basement renovations. So I'm glad to finally have something to show for it and something to put out for you guys. It was fun. I look forward to doing a lot more. I don't know how frequent uploads will be. I want to try to be as frequent as I possibly can. I have a lot of other videos planned and written down already. Lord knows I have a backlog, both between Gundam, Warhammer, other models. So I don't have any shortage of things to make videos on, which is a good thing. So, that being said, if you enjoyed it, please make sure you like it and share it with some friends or hobby groups, and consider subscribing if you do want to see more. You don't have to, but if you want to, feel free. If you have any criticism as well, please just let me know, because this is the first time I've ever done something like this, and I learned a lot doing it. But I'm sure there's other things from a viewer's perspective that I may not pick up on, so if there's anything, please let me know so I can fix that for the future. And with that, this has been Plaid Hobbies, signing off. Thank you for watching, have a great night, and I'll see you in the next episode.
And now, folks, we thank you for joining us tonight. We hope this evening was filled with love and entertainment, and that you happily sleep through the night and join us again tomorrow. Good night, and sleep well.